And welcome again to Critical Thinking. I'm Professor Borrowdale, and today we're going to be talking about postmodernism, critical theory, academia and the academic climate, ideological diversity in academia, and thinking critically about the general context of all the things you're learning, including in this particular class, and in the context of how should you take things you learn in your classes, in textbooks that are part of the curriculum? How do you think about the sort of institutional commitments that campus has, including all the activities in campus life and the various kinds of clubs and the speakers that are brought to campus and the things administrators have to say and the general curriculum of the college and all that kind of stuff. So let's see. Announcements. The extra credit exam is open through next Friday, the Friday week 10. The Thanksgiving holiday. I'm totally making this recording that evergreen now. I'm I might use this for next term for my critical thinking online class. So ignore all this stuff if you're taking this in the online class. The lab closes at 2 o'clock Wednesday on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. So if you're going to take the extra credit exam on Wednesday, make sure to get there by 1. I guess that's it as far as announcements go. Anybody have things that they wanted to say about our last class talking about critical thinking about ethics? Stylus here. Well, maybe we should jump right into the new topic then. So to avoid falling behind. Any thoughts on? So I had a few videos to watch. I thought a lot of this stuff. You have these great lectures from people with degrees from the Ivy League, people who are leaders in their field. It's all online. It's all on video. You can hear these guys lecture, give talks of various kinds. And so I picked some kind of controversial people, people on the leading edge in talking about the academy, and particularly I'm focused on critics of different aspects of academia, because it's easy to talk about all the wonderful things about academia, but I think there are some sort of skeptical, critical thinking type concerns that you need to keep in mind in doing any kind of academic career as a student, or if you're thinking about going into education, to keep these things in mind, that academia is not reality. And you might think about the ivory tower, at Harvard and Yale, but we've got our own little version of the ivory tower here. Maybe it's an ivory yurt or something. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's not a tower. Maybe it's sort of like the ivory, somewhat tall building or something. But we've got our own version of the ivory tower here, and I think it's important to think about things in context. So let me see if I can call these up, take them in order specifically. One thing to think about, I suppose, is thinking about your professors. Who goes into education? Think about what kinds of people you think about. It's interesting to think about why do people go into education, particularly in fields where they could be making a lot more money in the private sector.
If there's enough participants, they want to pass on some new information or new style that may not be as open currently.
Yeah, so it might be that they're more interested in things sort of you get why do people improve? Yeah. Or green. So now we want to make sure. Remember, there's the ad hominem, which says, don't look at the personal qualities of a person. Don't try to psychoanalyze them, but focus on what they're saying. And I think that's really important to consider when you go down this road. But also, it's important to thinking about bias and objectivity when you get information being presented, And particularly when someone's being presented to you as an expert and you're the student and you have a textbook which you think is, has been peer reviewed and everybody thinks that therefore everything is true. And if there's some deference to authority, you might think about in terms of the authority presenting this, well, how much credence should I give to this? And is there likely to be some form of bias in what's being presented to me? So one of the cases in which an appeal to authority can be illegitimate, or at least be, as I'll use the word questionable, right? Where you ought to be extra skeptical. You ought to be skeptical of authority, period. Let me just put that out there, right? Be skeptical of authority. Doesn't mean like you don't believe anything, but at least you should have a certain amount of skepticism before you accept something true on the basis of some expert. And you want to know who is the expert, what are they expert in, and then do they have an axe to grind, do they have a financial interest, is there some reason do they have a bad track record, is there some reason to suspect that maybe they're not giving you the straight dope? So why do people become professors? And you think, generally speaking, you get people who are sort of, there's a couple of things. You mentioned,
Influence?
Yeah, they want to be influencers, I suppose. So they, there's people that love, people love learning and they like talking about intellectual topics. That's one thing to consider. So tend to be kind of like idealists. Oops. Idealistic. Tend to be sort of people that like helping people, like helping personality. Yeah, I really like helping students, and I'll say, again, that if you're struggling with the class, and actually people are doing really well in this class. I'm impressed with the test scores, and congratulations to all of you. Also, I'm really impressed with like the high level of discussion we've had in this class, where nobody has expressed hostility or like there's been no name calling. People have been very civil and courteous, and particularly when we're talking about these sensitive issues. I'd really like to hand it to you guys for conducting yourselves with the utmost of courtesy and respect towards your fellow students. But one of the reasons I went into teaching is because I like talking about ideas and I like learning, and that's like really interesting to me. And the subject matter, philosophy and religion, have always been interesting to me. But I like helping people. That's why I'm at a community college. That's why I'm not at a research institute, because to me it's all about people. And it's about like people regardless of background or all these other sort of extraneous things that I talk about like in the Rethinking Diversity article. It's like those things, they add color to our life and they're interesting, but that's not what like individuals are about. And I always try to treat my students as individuals as opposed to members of groups, and think about, okay, well, who are you? Well, here are these surface characteristics. You're a woman, or you're this certain race, or you look like you're part of this cultural group, or you have an accent, so therefore you fit in this category. I just look at, or even you're white, or whatever that means, and that I assume all sorts of things about you. Oh, you're privileged, and you come from money, and you've had a great life, and you've had everything handed to you. So all these negative stereotypes and even positive stereotypes that go around about groups. And I say, to hell with all of them. I want to treat people as individuals. And so that, to me, that's really important. And it's about like wanting to help people and wanting to help, not just sort of a generalized feeling I want the world to be a better place, but like helping individual people, getting like, nice people take my class and they tell me how much they learned or that I made them think about things, and that's an extremely gratifying thing. But that's like a personality type. Some people, they don't give a damn about that. They're like very like, they're kind of keep themselves, they're kind of live a hermit lifestyle, or they have some job where they're like, working on cars all day, right? Some people really love like mechanical things. I'd say this is like a more kind of stereotypical feminine characteristic that that I have. And people, again, they're on a spectrum as far as there's male and female biologically, and then there are all these personality traits, and they're distributed in different ways. And I'd say that's a big part of what makes me happy, is like being able to help other people. What other things about professors here? People that prize things like stability, loving, and also not money focused. So people that are like much more practical, that care much more about living a more affluent lifestyle. Certainly academia, there are certain, this is a comfortable lifestyle. Also people that are like sort of there's a lot more stressful positions too. So it's maybe people that like more of a low-key lifestyle. Some professors here might disagree with me, and I tend to get hectic about, particularly in this time of the term. But all these things, so then you think about, okay, does the makeup of academia, does that affect like the kinds of information that might be presented? Like what would these things bode for, like, say, politically? Or you think how that might affect like the right-left spectrum, or conservative to liberal? Yeah.
From my experience, I've had almost solely Democratic English teachers. And as an English major, like, that has definitely like influenced a lot of my political beliefs, just because that's what the side that has been argued. But once I stepped outside of that, I actually found like a lot of inconsistencies in what I actually believed and what I had been told and kind of like assumed was my belief, because that's what most of my generation believed. You know what I mean? So I think that definitely, like, the teachers that I've had have 100% impacted how I view politics. Yeah. Because it really does come up a lot in an English classroom.
Yeah, surprisingly, like that you see politics come up, in all, even in your biology class. It'll show up like all over the place. And when people are writing papers, there's people like talking about hot button issues and things that students are engaged in. Although, some instructors, hopefully not yours truly, will use class as a chance to sort of stump for one political position. And what I try to do is, and I suppose I see that I'm a little more critical of the liberal or progressive views, because those are the ones I encounter every day, and they're institutionally pervasive, from the administrator to the staff, to the professors, and down on the line, and maybe not to the the custodial staff or and the people that work in food services, but pretty much in anything involved with teaching and learning, but even down to like the way they handle the garbage, right? You got a sustainability coordinator that makes sure that everything's composted and environmentally sound and so on. So you have politics infusing everything. You read the college mission statement, you can see references to political concepts in there. And the mission statements and core values, you might think, oh, it's just some statement that's up on a website. And does it really mean anything? Well, when people make funding decisions about, say, whether there are more philosophy classes or whether they should hire back the coordinator of the Native American student program, for example, right? So they got, say, $60,000, $80,000, something like that, to throw around, more with the healthcare and all that stuff, right? They have some money for a full-time position. When they're making those choices, they just don't do it in a vacuum. They got all these, ideological commitments, plus the academic culture. So these formal things are actually affect funding positions. So the mission and the core values are at the top, and those are the criteria that your top level administrators use to decide what programs are going to expand, what programs are going to contract, when they're going to lay off people, when they're going to add people. And it's all based on these ideological commitments. And then there's, in addition to these formal ideological commitments, there's a campus culture, which is a kind of an informal consensus that here are the values that are most important, here are the values that are less important. When push comes to shove, this one over that one. Yeah?
About those idealistic commitments that you mentioned, you can see it really on every level. The water fountains you see, like they have the sensor that you
Oh,
see in
yeah.
the water bottle. In Texas, Florida, not even a little bit. Like it's not, you don't see it anywhere. The recycling and the compost and all those different
Yeah.
trash cans, also not a thing. So you can definitely see, like, you know, just in every room, the difference in culture.
And you know, and some of those things, like, you know, you can say that they're you know, they're good. Like the idea, I'm just incensed with the idea that, like, I don't know, the college selling like bottles of water when the water out of the tap is perfectly safe. And you can buy like a little, you know, water bottle carry around like this with a built-in filter if you're paranoid about it. You know, Oregon is one of the few places where the water's not fluoridated, so you don't have to worry about that. You know, live down in Cottage Grove, we get a little bit of arsenic in the water that pops up every once in a while. Don't have to worry about that. You know, it's all in the dosage, right? So, and so some of these things you think about, like, you know, being not trying to increase the garbage and being good stewards of resources and so on. I think they're good things. But when it infuses everything that the college does, and you have, like, for example, there's no chemistry club, but there's a green chemistry club. Now, I'm sure the green chemistry club is perfectly lovely, to coin a phrase. And I have no objection to the green chemistry club, but there's no chemistry club. Nobody's interested in chemistry, only green chemistry. And so all these things, there's the formal institutional picture. So let me put, so this is like, you know, LCC. So there's the formal institutional commitments, and you can read those on the Lane website. Just, you know, search for like college mission, core values. You know, I'm on committees, so I see this stuff in action. You know, you come to the and I go to the board meetings, and you can see like the mission and core values. You know, those things are the executive decisions at the top level are made based on these statements. They're not just, you know, PR or, you know, the lip service. And then there's the academic culture here, which is a kind of informal attitudes that people have. So in order to have like institutional prejudice, it's not just, or bias, it's not just like, here are the written rules. There's the written rules and there's the unwritten rules. There's sometimes what's called de jure, which means there's an actual written world, and then there's de facto, which is like how it works out in the ordinary life, regardless of what the rules say. Here's what in fact happens. And both those things, you know, line up in certain ways and express certain values. And when you deal with the idea that we're a public institution and that roughly half the country would have a different view on the institutional commitments chosen by Lane and the mission and core values, or would even take umbrage with some of them, and that their particular ideological commitments not shared universally, but this is like a universal public institution, then you run into some questions about, you know, like the legitimacy of these commitments, and whether they ought to be changed or at least a little more, have something approaching like ideological diversity on campus. Let me just add one more thing here. Gosh, something popped into my head. The idealistic, helping, stability loving, not money focused. Maybe it'll come back to me later. Something that was important to put on this list. You think of anything else that your professors, you think about a person who's going to the professorship, what are they interested in? Besides, I sort of talking about ideas and spreading information.
I think there's probably some aspect of arrogance. You know, I've seen that in a lot of my professors. You know, just like the fact that they have something more to offer than say someone else. Like they have the right answer, and the right answer is what it is, and I know for sure. Especially in English, where almost everything's up for interpretation. I've had a lot of professors who are absolutely certain that they're right. You know, It's like, well, you know, you really can't tell if you're right or not.
Yeah. As I suppose prestige and the arrogance of power. I'd say like, I think a line from Socrates, he says, you know, well, the starting part is to realize, you know, you don't know anything, and then you try to figure some things out. And part of this is, you know, Socrates, when he says, my knowledge is that I know nothing, there's a little bit of hyperbole there, because you read the Socratic dialogues, and even the early ones, you know, Socrates knows a lot more than he's letting on, and part of it's his sort of method of trying to examine other people's beliefs, and also, you know, asking questions. And the skeptical tenor, I think, is really important, and particularly for your own beliefs. But I think if you take it too far, it turns into nihilism or relativism, both of which are bad. And I don't think Socrates took it that way, but it is important to have healthy skepticism, not just about other people's beliefs, about, you know, your own beliefs. And certainly I've had a rude awakenings where a bunch of facts ganged up on my pet theories, and then I ended up flipping and changing my mind about things. Okay, well, maybe this other thing will come back to me. So let's talk about, I hope, if you haven't seen them yet, I'd like to make sure to look at those videos. Some of them are pretty short. There's one, the longest one is like about 50 minutes. That's the Gad Sad is how you say his name. Is a podcast called The Sad Truth. He's a professor. He's at a university in Canada, I think, but he's got impeccable credentials, and he's actually in the business department and deals with like evolutionary psychology and marketing. So that's like a big thing about, a big thing in marketing today is this evolutionary psychology piece to try to figure out what people are likely to buy based on these evolved traits we have. Maybe I'll hit, this since we're talking about these sort of issues. Rethinking diversity. I wonder if I want to, maybe before that, so I have some readings and I've got the videos. Maybe I'll talk in general, like where like academic culture came from. Because I think some people have this idea that this is just sort of how it turns out when people interested have these psychological characteristics, and they tend to be associated with certain political ideas, and that's just sort of the way things happen. This definitely has an effect, but you also have a long list of developments coming from intellectual movements that maybe, like it might be that you've never heard of these guys before, but they're affecting the way your professors think and how they approach things. So you have in Germany, there's this group called the Frankfurt School. This is a bunch of academics. This is sort of like a think tank. Maybe know what the original name for the Frankfurt School is? I guess this is like in World War I, around the World War I era in Germany, I think, is when it was first founded. It was first called the Institute for Marxism, right? And they changed the name. I forget what the revised name is. But they've got this, there was a something school in Frankfurt, shortened it to the Frankfurt School when people talk about it. And so there's a bunch of German intellectuals, German Marxists, and they went to New York and got jobs at Columbia. And the idea is so after they escaped, like they got out right before, as the Third Reich was coming up, they fled Germany and came over to America, and so these Marxists are really trying to figure out, like, why wasn't there a workers' revolution? Why? So the Marxist theory predicted that there's this antagonism between the petite bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, the owners of businesses basically, and the factory workers, the people who worked under them, and also the landowner and the farmhand, right? And the idea is that all these people on the bottom of society, the downtrodden, the disenfranchised, are going to rise up and seize the means of production, and all the means of production will be collectively owned. So basically, you're working at like some pizza parlor delivering pizzas for minimum wage, and it's like you and all the other pizza guys. You wait till the boss, comes in, and you all jump him, and you say, "Okay, boss, we're going to run this pizza joint. You're going to be working in the kitchen the rest of the time, and you're going to have to work like the rest of us instead of sitting back collecting the money and telling us to sweep the floor while there's nobody ordering pizzas. And we're going to run this joint now. It belongs to us, right?" So the idea is you do that like worldwide. Factory owners, farmhands. This is this thing you see happen in Zimbabwe with the basically the peasants, the agricultural workers rising up and killing or driving out primarily white farmers, and maybe got the land that they owned and so on through colonialism in some misbegotten ways. But basically drove them out and then said, we're going to run the farm now. And it was disastrous, and people, starving to death. Same thing in Venezuela. But I digress. So anyway, all these Marxists come over to Colombia and says, well, and they're thinking, where's the workers' revolution? And the idea is that, it's those damn capitalists. They're just creating too much prosperity. So you have like in the 40s and 50s, people getting refrigerators and TV sets, and they got a car and a nice picket fence, and everybody's doing really well. And people are going to college and the GI Bill. And so the Western Europe and to a lesser extent Western Europe, because it was kind of really wrecked by the war. But Western Europe and particularly the United States doing really well. And so you have this one guy, I don't remember which guy this was, one of the Frankfurt guys. He went off to like Southern California. This is like during the golden age of Hollywood. And he's like hanging out by the beach, and this beautiful, warm tropical weather and prosperity all around him. And he was just in a funk. He's like, this is terrible. How can we compete against this? And so they moved from the sort of economics of the worker to the oppressed. And basically the move is from economic Marxism to cultural Marxism. And so these guys, an outgrowth of this is this thing called critical theory, which is basically get a bunch of, you go after the students, you get into the education system, and you just try to tear down. And you don't worry about what's going to come afterwards. And eventually we'll get people, first you get people riled up, pit people against each other. And so you try to attack all the institutions in America. You attack democratic capitalism, you attack the institution of the family, you attack the religious institutions. And the idea is to tear down all that stuff to pave the way for a Marxist revolution, because you're not going to you get some factory worker and he's just got a raise. He's got a nice union job. He's just got a raise there, and he's doing really well, and he's just bought a new car, and he's just bought a house, and everything's great for him. You're not going to be able to convince him that his life sucks and that he needs to throw off the shackles of capitalism when he's enjoying the fruits of capitalism. But the idea is if you can make him think that America is a deeply racist, sexist, moralistic, oppressive culture that only exists on the backs of the third world, and that it came to how it got to be by stealing land, by exterminating indigenous populations, and that the founders were racists and sexists and and terrible people, and that so the idea is you got to find victims where you can, right? You can't find economic victims, so you find other kinds of victims. So you see these books coming out about how America is a deeply authoritarian, racist, sexist society that oppresses people, and then sort of lures them into the capitalist system with promises of material reward while degrading all these other values and institutionalizing them. So what do you think about this as a strategy, I suppose? You know, is it cynical to see this as a strategy, or maybe they just said, maybe they had a point, maybe it's just they're framing something, but the frame fits. Yeah.
It seems like no matter how good things get, there's still a bad side to it. You know, we have running water. We didn't have running water 200 years ago, and there was still a worse than ideal. Sorry. And so, yeah, like it's easy to look at us and name all these great things, you know, economic progress, indoor plumbing, technology, fruits of everything that we have, you know, video games, computers, all that. You go to other places and they don't have that, but they also have, this is terrible about this and this is amazing about this.
Yeah.
So it kind of seems that, you know, it really depends on what you want to focus on instead of like how it actually is. Like there's always going to be a good and a bad.
Yeah, and you know, America's always been a mixed bag, and you know, there's good parts and bad parts. I think the idea of critical theory, though, is to focus on the worst and then to try to generalize that that's the institutions are thoroughly rotten and need to be changed. Yeah.
It sounds a lot like the book Rules for Radicals.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it seems like there's, like it says in the book, there's like 13 basic ways that you can get like the smaller population to turn on the bigger population.
Yeah.
And what you just described is almost exactly like that. And I mean, this was written by, now I can't remember his name.
Saul Alinsky.
Thank you, Saul Alinsky.
And he's actually out of the Frankfurt School. He's like one step removed from them. And his idea was to take what these intellectuals were writing and to get it down on the street level. So he spent time with the mob, and he would like run scams in school. Like they had the scam for like eating for free, that he'd take his friends around and they'd like get a meal ticket for a coffee, and then they go and like then they'd like order something, and they just sort of switch the tickets around. I forgot what, but it was complicated, and he'd like put up flyers on campus about, you know, eat for free, the Eat for Free Club. But he actually did spend time with the mob and see how mob organizations work, and then started his street agitation program. And you know, people go in, and one of the schools that taught people how to be, you know, community organizers. Barack Obama got to start in politics as a community organizer at a Alinsky tactic place, and you can see him in front of the chalkboard, like showing one of Alinsky's concepts and teaching young activists, you know, how to do things. So the stuff doesn't exist in a vacuum. It doesn't emerge organically. You know, part of this, now some of that may be afterwards, right? You get these influential ideas, people pick them up and start acting on them, and then they sort of seem like they're kind of part of the atmosphere. But originally, you just have a few people writing some books, spreading their ideas, they get picked up by other people, and pretty soon they become institutionalized. Thomas, do you have your hand up? Okay. So and this Alinsky comes from, I'll just write his whole name up here. So the Frankfurt School influenced Saul Alinsky. And then you had to see his influence on like a number of different people. But you know, politically, like Hillary Clinton wrote her senior thesis on Saul Alinsky. It was a very flattering, flattering discussion of his ideas. And still can't see it, so I don't think she wants anybody to read it. It's under seal at Wellesley, where she went to school. You know, and Barack Obama's at an Alinsky community organizer organization, I think the SEIU. So they're both like heavily influenced by him. and maybe I'll put, I don't want this to seem too partisan here. But at least you can see these intellectuals, both French and German intellectuals, like they have effects, and they're like, they sort of filter down through different people. But I'll just, a huge influence on both Hillary and Obama. And I think other people too. So, so the other part of this, you have, let's see, maybe I'll put, political correctness. This is all sort of like part of the Frankfurt School, the idea of wanting to control language and discourse by controlling the words people use. And to try to stifle dissent. So if you're pushing an ideological program, one way you can sort of insulate people by saying, well, this is maybe goes over like this. You can say, well, you can't say certain things about certain groups, even when they're acting badly. So if I criticize Barack Obama for, if I criticize him for his economic policy, say, well, there's this like automatic response, well, you're just a racist. You know, like, and then I say, well, no, I actually, my objection is to his white half, right, because he's mixed race. So, but this idea that you insulate people by smearing your opponents as racist, and I've had that happen to me, even though, like, as I said, I welcome all students of all races, creeds, even ideological persuasions. It's important for me to treat people as individuals, and that's always been a part of my value system. And I find racism and sexism and homophobia and even transphobia, I find those to be reprehensible. And I think all people deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. But I have to sort of walk on eggshells if I want to talk about some of these issues, because it's really easy to call somebody a Nazi. The picture of me with Milo Yiannopoulos, and who's a gay Jew married to a black man, and people call him a Nazi and a white supremacist. And I'm like, okay, well, if Milo could be called a Nazi, anybody can be a Nazi, right? So it's, and then you see people say, well, punch a Nazi in the face. It's, I'm looking over my shoulder. With let's see, political correctness. So this is this idea of, and you have the hate speech codes. We had a great discussion at the Speak Out on Saturday. There was this thing put together by two communication studies professors there at on Saturday. It was like 5 hours, but it was really good, especially in the morning. People talked about like hate speech and free speech and how we should understand them, and lots of good dialogue going back and forth. Okay, so political correctness, and this is the idea of I'll just put speech codes, and then this sort of chilling effect that if you want to say something, you better be quiet because your job may be at stake. And people, I think it's really great that people are very sensitive to these issues now, and now sexual harassment's like the latest one, right, where people are actually doing pretty horrible things. Charlie Rose is the latest head to roll. But yeah, so it's like, but I think it's important that even for saying something, like you say something, and it might not even be, so it's great that racism and sexism aren't tolerated, or at least, now that maybe there's contrary evidence that if you're in Hollywood or the media, it is tolerated. But at least in corporate culture and in academic culture, you can get in serious hot water for expressing racist or sexist views, and I think that's good. The institution needs to maintain fairness and make sure that students are being treated fairly. You got to think about the reputation of the institution. But on the other hand, it's really easy when those things are the only things people think about. It's when when you got a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail, and you're just looking for a nail to pound, and you can and you start looking for victimizers and victims, and maybe you might find some people who might look like a victimizer, but are just like expressing of you, but they look like a victimizer to you. Why? Because you don't agree with them. So the political correctness is these institutionalized speech codes, and unwritten rules about like what words you can say and how you can express yourself about certain thorny issues of race, class, and gender, and sexual orientation. I remember the thing. I remember the thing. It's like this is a big thing. Just squeeze it in here. Secular. Secular means non-religious. And academia is very secular. Yeah. The number of people with who are members of organized religions is much lower than the general population. Also, people tend to have fewer kids. No. I don't want to say no kids, but like I don't know if I can fit the word fewer in here. How about few kids? People are typically like involved in their career, and they put off having kids till late in life. And so you see, like, what are the sorts of things that make you like politically liberal or progressive? And you think, well, being somewhat idealistic as opposed to practical. Thinking about some idealized state of the world and wanting to like pass a bunch of rules and legislation and have judges, be arbiters of like what's fair and just and what would be, make the world a better place without any or sufficient thought to the practicalities of the matter. Conservatives tend to be more practically oriented. Being a helping person, again, more of a liberal trait. You're concerned with like helping people on the bottom. You're concerned about giving people a helping hand to move up. Personal responsibility is kind of low and you tend to think about people as victims rather than people that could do more to improve their situation. Risk takers tend to be conservative. The word conservative is kind of like a misnomer for like I think the kind of more limited government, individual responsibility type of ideology. But the people that go into business, for example, love risk taking. People that like to sit back and like have stability and a sure thing, even if they're not going to get that big of a reward, that's an academic career for you. Not focused on money at all. Again, conservatives tend to be more focused on money and financial. They're the guys that want to cut the budget, reduce services, have performance markers, and I'm not sure about the prestige thing. It might just be like a college professor thing, and you get special prestige in the society, I guess, for what that's worth. But the secular and few kids thing, that's a really big marker of whether you're liberal or progressive or not, or whether you're more conservative. It's whether you have a religious faith and whether you have any kids. And I've seen this in like friends of myself, or my own friends. They hit a certain age, they start having kids, and they start sending them to religious schools, or they want to go to church. Maybe it starts out with they want a Catholic wedding, and pretty soon they're like back to being thoroughly religious. And people in academia also tend to put off having kids for a long time. So that's another that's another marker. You look at people who are liberal and progressive; they tend not to have many kids, and they tend to be much more secular than the general population. So you think about this demographically, that it looks like the makeup of the academy would be made up by a bunch of liberals. Now this is what you might call like an a priori argument, or an argument based on kind of conceptual considerations. Now, I suppose it's based on like these characteristics or things that you can study and see that there's been actually work on this about the makeup of a person's personality and their political orientation. But if you look at the way it works out in fact, anybody remember about the statistics? If you looked at the statistics either in the readings or in one of the videos, how does that match up with this idea that people with these qualities are more likely to be liberal or progressive? Oops. What do you think? What would you expect? What's been your experience here? In as much as professors sort of express a view, or you kind of have a guess about what their view would be. Oops, come back here.
Mostly liberal.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, there's something, if you said Eugene's a liberal area, so maybe you'd have even more liberal professors than, say, in Texas or something like that. But you have overwhelmingly, liberal or progressive professors. And maybe, I don't know, for those who aren't interested in politics, I suppose, maybe I should say something about these labels, conservative or liberal progressive, right and left, Republican, Democrat, because they're parallel, but they're not exactly the same thing. So you have overwhelmingly low, and also administrators too. Administrators come from schools of education typically, and they tend to be very, very liberal. Even though, like, you might have, like, our former president Mary Spildey, like, in a lot of ways governed it like the worst example of like the most hard-nosed capitalist, cut it to the bone, and when there's a budget crisis. But when the money was flowing freely, it would be spend. So I don't know what. So maybe she'd flip back and forth between the budget hawk when she had to be and like the tax and spend liberal when the tax money was coming in. I don't know. But you'd have presidential quotes with quotes from Nelson Mandela and sort of bashing President Bush when he was president, bashing President Trump, saying nice things about the Obama administration, and that's sort of I suppose par for the course in an academic institution. So this is in fact, and Gad Saad mentions some of these statistics, and you get the professors. This is especially in in the social sciences and humanities. So things aren't as lopsided in the hard sciences like physics, engineering, but you see this a lot in the social sciences, humanities, and the arts. And it seems like this is especially egregious because it's in these fields that you deal with these controversial social issues, and you get kind of a presentation that favors one side of these kinds of issues that Americans are split on. So that seems like it's highly problematic. Particularly, again, in a public institution, which is supposedly should be committed to viewpoint neutrality, you don't see that this is the case. So let's take our break. Let's take 10 minutes and we'll talk about postmodernism. All right, well, what do you think about, let's see, we talk about a little bit of the history here. And sort of how academia became, like, not just, liberal, but radical. And maybe one other thing I'll mention before, go back to this question about the makeup of faculty, is talk about this idea of postmodernism. So we talked about, like, modernity. You can also call it modernism. This happened around the time of the Renaissance, 16th century, say, where you get the rise of science, and individualism.
History. History.
Like as a discipline?
History, actually moving in from using like history as, oh my gosh, I'm totally butchering this, moving from history being a collection of stories to history being a collection of facts.
It's like
was the same time, 1700s.
Okay, like the first, like sort of, maybe call it like the rigorous recording of history.
Like narration to like.
I'm not sure. I mean, Herodotus, like his chroniclers. I'm wondering. Maybe I don't know much about like history as a discipline because I like read Herodotus in at school. He's like the first historian. He's writing ancient Greece, but maybe like the modern historical method where there's like critical thinking about like whether these stories are true or not that you're getting from people.
Yeah, that was right around the same time that science became kind of.
So
that's when people started moving away from the mythology because then, like you said, they started filling in the gaps. Suddenly things didn't make a whole lot of sense at the same time.
Historical method. And then things like the rise in general of like, the different branches of learning, branching off from you'd have like just what they used to call natural philosophy. And then you get specializations in biology and then later on anthropology and sociology and psychology, and it used to all just be natural science, and then it starts to break up into physics and chemistry, and so just because there's so much to learn, that to be competent or an expert in any one field means that you by necessity you can't study all these other fields. So this idea of being a Renaissance man, it sort of goes by the wayside, even though there are people in academia today that have like broad knowledge. I say philosophers or like fall into that category. You can't be like a specialist in the nitty gritty of a bunch of different fields because there's too much to know, and it also keeps on changing with our increases in knowledge. So the historical method, also market capitalism. Pardon me.
Atheism.
I'll just say secularization. And then this representative democracies. So this gets kind of phased in, where you get a parliament, which is made up of nobility and then commoners, and then the king, eventually becomes the figurehead. And you have these parliamentary democracies, and you have America, the first sort of pure democracy or let's say pure democratic republic without a king, without any hereditary aristocracy. And in fact, like there's bans in the Constitution. If you want to be in office, if you want to hold federal office, you cannot take a title of nobility on. It's actually written there right in the Constitution. So there's this idea of a classless society, I suppose. And you have a president instead of a king. So representative democracy. And this idea of individual rights, like freedom of religion, freedom of the press. I'll just put individual rights here. You're not a subject, you're a citizen now. I'll put this subject. You used to be subject to the king, and now you're a citizen in the sense that people in Athens were citizens, the ones that weren't slaves, right? But the people, the citizens of Athens, they had a pure democracy that it was often dysfunctional and had periods of where it gave way to dictatorial rule, then went back to democracy. And the founding fathers saw this and tried to sort of patch it up so it would work well. Took the experiments in Europe and came up with this sort of new. I think America is really uniquely the first pure representative republic experiment in self-governance, and it's part of the modern period. This is late 18th century, 1700s, right? So all these things are innovations, that came on the heels of like the 1,000 years of the Dark Ages after the Roman Empire fell apart, and a lot of it was rediscovering all these classical virtues of representative government, of markets, of science, scholarship, treating people as individuals, and giving them some say in how their lives go. And so, so all this stuff is sort of part and parcel, and along with secularization, I suppose, and separation of church and state, right? It's part of the individual rights, freedom of religion. So you look at postmodernism, what's that? Well, something comes after modernism, right? So postmodernism. So maybe I could try to parallel things here. Suspicious of science. Maybe I'll just say it. I'll say anti-science. I think that's a safe thing to say. Anti-science can take a more extreme forms and less extreme forms. There's this idea that science is socially constructed, that it's part of the phallocentric worldview, and it's part of the patriarchy. It's a means by which men exploit the environment and despoil Mother Earth. It's modern mythology. So a lot of the postmodernists will say that science is just sort of modern. It's a modern myth, and it's based on all these assumptions, and it's socially constructed, meaning that there's nothing objective about the scientific method that gives us truth. It's just a story that we tell. It's one narrative among many, and then we shouldn't prioritize scientific knowledge over, say, the traditions of the elders of indigenous peoples, or the spiritual beliefs of some isolated tribe, or all these other beliefs that we have, or our own subjective personal experiences. So this goes along with this it being relativistic. And I suppose here, this idea of reason is really important, and this idea of like universal truth of reason and a uniting culture, like the idea that the canons of rationality are the same for everyone, and we can talk to each other and improve the world, and a certain kind of optimism as well, I suppose. But reason is seen as really important there, and where before science was seen as the handmaid of theology. So in the Middle Ages, that people saw science and philosophy as sort of the handmaid of theology. So theology is called the queen of the sciences, and then in the service of theology we do philosophy to try to figure out our religious beliefs and have some semblance to them. We do the sciences to discover the wonders of God's creation, right? And then you get the rise of science and religion taking a lesser role, and then all of a sudden it's not theology, but it's science is just sort of at the top of the heap, or philosophy, if you will, and then you get sort of a reordering of I hear where I was going with this. oh, this idea that this is objective knowledge, this objective worldview, and it's not based on faith. It's not based on faith. It's based on reason and science, the scientific worldview. And postmodernism says, well, no, really, that's just like Western culture. Other cultures have different beliefs, and who are we to judge? And so the postmodernists will say there are different kinds of knowing, and that scientific knowing is no better than any other form of knowing. Marxist. So you have like this is this French intellectual authors. So you have there's three big ones: Derrida, Foucault, Jacques Lacan. These are the big ones. Also suspicious of reason. Suspicious of reason to solve life's problems. Suspicious that reason is a determinate thing. Blurring the distinction between reason and feelings. And this goes along maybe with the relativist thinking. Also secular, so strongly secular. Sort of collectivist in its thought, which goes along with the Marxism. So dealing with people in groups as opposed to individuals. One last thing. And also very, this is nothing I had in the modernist thing, but I suppose very jargony. I go back and forth about whether this is something which is done on purpose or whether it's just sort of like a weird cultural norm in this field. I'll say that any field has jargon, and so sometimes it's hard to pick it up. So in the sciences, there's certain jargon that you have to pick up and understand what it is. And I'm taking political science classes at University of Oregon, and there's all these different theories, and people talk about something being constructivist, or they talk about frames, or there's all these different terms that people use. And, it took me a while to sort of catch up on them. But, you read the stuff and you're like, okay, it makes sense. I could look up a word in an academic encyclopedia and figure out what they're talking about. I can understand the word in context. Postmodernism, good luck. Maybe I'll read some Derrida next class just for fun. Foucault is probably the most readable of the postmodernists. But I think also like when you understand, you're like, really, that seems kind of common sense or trivial or something. So I'm not sure that he's all that insightful. Derrida and Lacan, particularly Derrida, are tough to read. My advisor, when I was a graduate student, had a thing on his bulletin board, and Derrida actually came to our campus to give a speech. He was the English department, not philosophy, because the philosophy department didn't see Derrida as being a real philosopher. And he writes this sort of literary criticism, which is about literature, but it's also heavily philosophical. And you find Derrida and Foucault like really big in the English department, literature department of most colleges and universities, and particularly, and sometimes in the philosophy department too. So anyway, he had like it's like an excerpt for the talk. It was like a little tiny paragraph about what he's going to be talking about. And so my professor put this on his bulletin board, and right next to it, he's like circled it in like the campus newspaper and wrote, "I will give $100 to anyone who can tell me what this means." And there were no takers. Nobody even tried, because I guess because there weren't any deconstructionists or people that follow Derrida in the department, and it was Greek to everybody else. Now, you study this stuff for long enough, and you read enough of it, it starts to make a certain kind of sense. But the specialized jargon only makes reference to other jargon, and so you get what I would say is the illusion of meaning. And Nietzsche referred to people that do this sort of thing as obscurantists, who are basically trying to make other people think that they're dumb by writing things that they can't understand. I'm not sure that's entirely the case, but this goes back to the arrogance that you talked about. This might be, part of that the arrogance of being, a French intellectual. It is talking this jargony way. So anyway, so that's part of this movement, and so this is why like moral relativism is really big. This is why Marxism and neo-Marxism is big on campus. It's and it's also why, like in the social sciences in particular, you have you have a kind of anti-science attitude, and a suspicion of reason to solve human problems. Now you don't see it as much at the community college. If you're going to Harvard or Yale, you get a lot more of this than here at community college. We're somewhat insulated from this stuff. But it comes down in the textbooks and the attitudes of faculty. And some of the faculty, you look at sociology, anthropology are sort of at the top of the list that are most skewed ideologically. Where I think it's, I think they did a study at UC Berkeley. It was like 30-1 left wing versus right wing, or conservative versus liberal. I think they looked at party affiliations. And the people have looked at the elite schools, and they sort of look at party registrations, or they send a survey and ask them how they would characterize their politics, and then look at so these are the most liberal, anthropology and I think political science. And then you get like different, I don't know the rankings of the rest of them, but these are the ones that are the most liberal. And these are like the extreme, like sociology is virtually no one that has like even centrist views in sociology. And same thing with the anthropology, particularly the people that specialize in cultural anthropology. And in there's the, so to say, social sciences and humanities. And the arts to a certain extent. The arts are typically really liberal. But you look at the hard sciences, it's a lot more even. So here, this is a kind of an interesting thing, like why do you suppose the difference would be here? That you get like more ideological diversity, or more of a mixed view in the controversial social issues or political affiliation in the hard sciences than you would in the social sciences. Yeah.
The social sciences revolve around people and how they live their lives and the decisions they make, as to where hard science is more like objective based, like this freezes at this temperature, that's just a fact.
Yeah.
So that you might have like a little bit more, like the way you look at things, it's going to base the way you look at it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And maybe, again, people with more focused on people would gravitate towards that. There's the if you have the kind of crusader personality, academia is the place for you, right? So that's another thing. And you can't promulgate views on these social issues too much if you're in the hard sciences. And so if you're kind of an idealist, change the world type person, you might be able to change it through scientific research, but then you're probably going to be focusing on research and not teaching. But I think in the hard sciences, there are people who are of a more practical bent, less ideological, more focused on the facts. And there you get, it's still liberal, but at least it's not as out of whack as in the social sciences. And you get all basically people, the children of the 60s, the 60s radicals, getting professorships. So they in the 60s, you had the countercultural revolution, and all the activism was on campus, and these are people with like college deferment, so they're not going off to Vietnam, the men, and so you have all sorts of anti-war activism, and then other kinds of activism going on. With the women's liberation, as they called it at the time, the feminist movement, race-based movements, and so all this kind of, and then the sexual revolution, all this stuff was happening on campus. So people in their formative years are there on campus, and they're like, the professor isn't as liberal at that time. But then all these people that went to college instead of getting killed in Vietnam, they got into academic jobs, and wanted to change the culture from the inside. Now a lot of them became yuppies and became less radical over time. But if you think about so you have all these people coming into academia who are former '60s radicals, and you see people like Bill Ayers, right? He's got this nice professorship at University of Chicago. He's a member of the Weather Underground. He's a terror bomber, and he said in an interview, "I don't regret setting bombs. I wish we'd done more." So and Angela Davis, and you just sort of go down the line of these people who were at the forefront of the countercultural movement and sometimes violent, engaging acts of terrorism, and they've got like fancy professorships at elite institutions. I think one last thing on this, you think about the political views of a person from the standpoint of, again, I want to make sure to avoid the ad hominem, but also make some concessions to human nature. So you think about, okay, what is an academic job? It's a government, it's a safe government unionized job funded by tax dollars. Yeah, I'll put safe in quotes here because apparently my job wasn't that safe. So, but relatively safe. The chance of getting laid, the chance of getting laid off. I used to yuck it up with my colleagues, saying, that the last private job will go in Oregon and we'll still be employed here at the college, because it's really, apart from like budget cuts, it's really hard to lose an academic job. You have this thing called tenure, which is protection for faculty to engage in academic freedom, to be able to teach without worried about offending some administrator or and then getting fired. So this is meant to facilitate the free exchange of ideas, so a person can speak freely about worrying about their job. I think it seems like it's a good thing. But you think about, okay, so you have a person whose job has extra protections by law. They're working for the government. They're in a union, one of the most powerful unions in the United States, the NEA or the AAUP, American Association of University Professors. There's another one called the AFT, but mostly it's the NEA and the OEA is part of that, Oregon Educational Association. So you get a unionized government employee who's funded by your tax dollars. So what do you suppose his political views might be about, like, say, government programs? Or about unions? Yeah.
That they're good?
Yeah, I mean, you think about that, there's a reason why someone went into a job like this as opposed to something else. So they're probably pro-union, they're likely to be really supportive of big government programs, tend to take umbrage with conservatives that want to cut the budget and get rid of their jobs. So there's something to be said about when you think about when you're learning something in class, including this one. Think about yourself. This is a government employee supported by tax dollars in a unionized, safe job, and now he's going to talk to me about politics. And He's also from a demographic group that's likely to be extremely liberal, and this job, the job he's doing right now, the teaching job, tends to attract liberal people. And then think about all those things, and then think about your learning and how those two things might be related. And that's not saying you should disregard what you learn in a class, but you should always keep this in the back of your mind of like where it's coming from. At least that's my view. And I don't think why am I like beating up on like liberalism and progressivism and well, it's because it's the institutionalized view, and it speaks to bias. So now if you were at I suppose you're going to Bob Jones University, I might give you a different line, right? Or if it's like a private Christian college, right? Or if you're going to Northwest University, right? I say, well, your professors are likely to they have a religious commitment. That's why they're working in a religious institution. And what you're going to learn in your academic classes is going to be informed by their Christian commitment, and that might not necessarily represent like what secular scholars say about the subject, particularly if you're taking, say, a theology or religion class at Northwest versus here. So it's got its own set of biases there. Now, you take a class here, you might get a different set of ideological commitments and biases. So you always want to think about this in the back of your mind. Or again, at least that's my view. I don't know if there's a counter narrative or counterpoint to this. What do you think? And not just about the government job, but in general about like thinking about, okay, what is the makeup of the professorship? What is the standpoint of the individual professor and his personality and his commitments? Again, as a group, not necessarily an individual professor. And then what sorts of how might this affect their teaching when it comes to controversial social or political issues? Yeah.
Actually, it's like kind of a real life example. I won't use any names, obviously, but it is in this college, and I have a friend who is very much so a Republican on almost every level and pretty vocal about that. He has some good views, though. I mean, he makes a lot of sense when he speaks about it, and he's not just being irrational, so he is a good source. He puts a fair amount of personal research into his views. And he's in a class, an early on writing class that is led by a primarily Democratic teacher. And he has actually like complained to me that like most of the discussions that go on in there are really heavily swayed toward like kind of making the students believe in Democratic views. Like he only argues positively about Democratic views, and like consistently puts down Republican views in class. To the point where he actually like had to stand up to the teacher in class and say, no, like that isn't true. Like you can't say that in here. Mm-hmm. And after that, he started receiving like kind of bad grades.
Yeah.
And it was, I don't know the quality of his work. Like I can't attest to that at all, but it was, and then another student who was in that class and Democratic came to me and is in the same class as both that teacher and the other student and complained to me about my friend. Because he was standing up for his views in class and she was like putting him down for being Republican. And I was like, wow, okay, so this is the kind of mindset that can bring about, is not only is now the professor kind of talking down on these Republican views that he can support very thoroughly, but now the students in that class are looking down on him for having those views because they've been so heavily swayed toward democracy. Again, that could have been before the class. Yeah. But it was pretty interesting to see it kind of come out in the wash like that.
That is interesting. It's and I get these stories from students too. I had a student that did a stint in the military, and he was interested in anthropology, and he was talking with a professor at University of Oregon, and she said, "Well, what have you been doing? Like, you're kind of older student. What have you been doing in between like high school and now?" And he's like, "Well, I did a stint in the military," and she said, "Well, I think you'll find that you have to be a bit more broad-minded than that to be at University of Oregon," and like turned her back and left, and just like left him out in the cold because he's a veteran, and you get views like that in the academy too. That might be an extreme example, But it's something to consider when you think about, you know, the talking about intellectual ideas and talking about institutional bias and whether things are presented in a fair light. And I try in this class to give an even-handed presentation of the issues. And I'd say, like, on this, you know, someone might say is, well, you know, there's a reason, maybe the reason why there's so many liberals in academia is because the liberal views on all these issues are just true, right? I don't know if that's, when I say it like that, it sounds like a straw man, but I mean, there are lots of people that believe that. And so they'd say, well, the reason that, you know, basically the reason people go into academia because they're interested in, you know, the pursuit of truth and scholarship and so on. And then there's these other people that, that sort of have this ideology where they have these kind of superstitious religious beliefs, or they were like born with a heart 3 sizes too small, or something, they have something wrong with them psychologically, and for whatever reason they vote Republican, you know, or they're anti-science, or it's usually connected with a religious thing. Although there are lots of secular and you know, non-fundamentalist Republicans certainly. But the idea is that the ideas of the liberal and progressive movement are, you know, based in science and based in reason, and so that the reason that they gravitate towards the academy is because that's how things are. But then, so you wouldn't expect, would you expect like the sciences to be more even-handed, right? Those people are interested in science and reason. Certainly, maybe to more extent, they're more interested in objectivity and science and the world as it really is in the hard sciences, and those are much more balanced. And so it seems that if that argument were a valid argument, it would be, you wouldn't see this big disparity in the social sciences. Yeah.
Does I don't know, not just call me liberal, I guess, but I don't feel like liberal and progressive are necessarily the same thing. Like, maybe they just seem liberal and progressive because the more we learn, the more we change, and progress is nothing more than us constantly changing. So maybe that's why it appears that those who study seem more progressive. In reality, they're just learning more than the layman about the world and everything, and they're realizing, oh, this has to change, et cetera, et cetera.
It's these labels are always hard. Conservatives don't necessarily want to conserve like existing institutions, although on some of these social issues, the people are you know, don't want to change, I suppose, and you do get like people that are like religious conservatives that want to hold on, like they want to oppose, say, gay marriage, for example. But then there depends on like what kind of change that you're talking about, right? So, right to work, right? There's going to be a bill on right to work in Oregon. That would be a change. Some people might see it as progress. How do you know whether that's a progressive view or a regressive view?
Well, population's going up, so there's more, you know, need for those things. So I guess, you know, could be considered progressive because you want to change the way it functions right now to fit the change that's going to happen, that's going to continue to happen.
Yeah,
it's like trying to go from the cure to prevention when you're still sick, though.
I'm not sure. I have to think about like unionization and population. Basically, the right to work thing says joining a union is voluntary. Like right now, you know, and I actually, our union is great, and the union's fighting for me now, so I appreciate that. But I also oppose on principle the idea that dues are extracted from my paycheck involuntarily, whether I want to join the union or not. And I'd say it's the union's it's the union's job to woo me into supporting them voluntarily. And if they got a problem with free riders of people who are benefiting from collective bargaining without paying anything in, I mean, that's the problem they have to deal with, right? But it's not my problem if I don't want to join the union. If I make the judgment it's not worth it, if I work out my own deal with the administration, that seems like that should be my right. So that's the right to work thing. but you know, how do you, is that progressive or regressive? And so this goes to these sort of labels of, and maybe I need to talk about, and I think there is a difference between maybe liberal and progressive mean different, and they have a different nuance. Liberal is more of a kind of an old style word, and progressive is a new style word. Liberal, if you read in academic context, actually can mean a lot of different things. Classical liberalism is the political philosophy that goes along with modernism, which is all about like individual rights, free market capitalism, self-determination, individual responsibility, and having the government do very few things and leave individuals otherwise free to pursue happiness in their own way. So that's like the old. It's called classical liberalism. Adam Smith, David Hume. So that's. And that's, very similar to this idea of conservatism. Limited government, constitutional republic, government leaves people free to work out their own deals. They provide courts to keep people from killing each other and from blood feuds. They have an army to keep out foreign invaders. And other than that, things are controlled by states or local. This the idea of federalism is also kind of a classical liberal idea. And then you get the what we call like liberalism, maybe modern liberalism. Sort of this idea of the welfare state. The progressive movement was something that happened in like the 19th century, and it's basically inspired by the Karl Marx and his acolytes. This idea of empowering the worker, that you need to equalize things. The French Revolution, the same sort of thing, where you had the guillotine and the Reign of Terror, and basically the working class rising up and trying to get some power. And so the liberalism or the progressive movement, modern liberalism, progressive movement, and actually maybe I should put this first, sorry. Chronologically, I think the progressive movement's 19th century. Modern liberalism is more of a 20th century thing. And you have, FDR, fix this, Johnson, Great Society. And this idea that government should be all things to all people, should have lots and lots of government services, the government should run education and healthcare and pension system and provide you a job, and if it can't provide you a job, it should pay you money to live on. And then along with that, maybe the sort of countercultural revolution ideas in the 60s get incorporated into liberalism as well. But the two basic ideas, and they're kind of the collectivist and individualist notions. Progressives and liberals tend to see people as being the victim of circumstance, of impersonal social forces that set the tone for their lives. And whereas the conservatives tend to be more individualistic and says, it's up to you. It's you're responsible to make something of your life. The government provides sort of a playground for you to make your way in life and set some sort of basic parameters, but other than that, it's up to you. And you have like the ability to support yourself and to prosper, and you should be free to do that in whatever way you like. Whereas the more collectivist idea is that no, you're part of society. The most important thing is that you're not, getting an unfair advantage. We need all sorts of structures and institutions to make sure everybody's fair and equal. And we don't trust people to make their own decisions. Sometimes people make bad decisions, so we can either, nag them or we can coerce them into making better decisions. And that people who are failing in life for whatever reason, they're on the bottom, that we need to take from the haves and give to the have-nots to make things more equal. Which is sort of, from each according to his abilities, to each according to his need, the kind of Marxist idea. And so these are like the two basic ideologies. Now, in America, like I said, we have this weird kind of glomming on of classical liberalism with this kind of religious Puritanism, which is a peculiarly, let's say the word peculiarly American thing. And so and that's just, I think, a product of coalition politics. And part of it, too, I think, is the sort of, the more the Marxist, liberal, progressive, collectivist view, like, Marx is like, was very virulently anti-religion, right? He's the guy that said religion is the opiate of the mass, right? Opiate of the masses. The opiate crisis right now, all these people taking pills is basically the same thing as heroin. So it's the opiate of the mass. Religion drugs you and makes you stupid, so you can be easily controlled. And that's been a view that's permeated left-wing politics. But this is the left and this is the right. So you'd think religion actually, particularly fundamentalist religion, finds more of a home in the conservative tradition. And so coalition politics being what it is, you have like evangelical Christians being a big part of the conservatives. Although you look at like Catholics, they tend to be Democrats and tend to be more liberal or progressive in their social views. So and tend to be more nominal too. So I suppose you might see them as more, see church as a cultural thing. So it doesn't mean that if you're religious necessarily you're going to go towards the conservative view. Anyway, these are two ideologies, and basically, the country's almost split down the middle as far as like the whole demographics. So then the question comes up, when you have a public institution, how should things go? Should you care about ideological diversity, or should you have a laissez-faire attitude of just that the cards fall by where they may?
First one?
Yeah. Go ahead. Do you think?
Because whether or not, regardless of what kind of attitude you have about it, it's the system we have, it's taking place, and it's going to affect your life and others.
Yeah, so maybe you should take an interest in having a little bit of fairness. And maybe think about, like, when you hire that next professor, are you just going to hire another doctrinaire liberal? Or maybe you'd hire someone who's doing some research in some area that maybe questions the liberal orthodoxy and some contentious social view. It's something. And this whole thing has been about like objectivity. So you think about, you're in academia, you're taking classes, and then you have certain information presented to you in this class and other classes, and you think, okay, well, how should I take that? You think about the professor who's supposed to be the expert, and you think, okay, what did I learn in my critical thinking class? What's he an expert in? Is he? And here it's, I suppose it's pretty. Things are they do a pretty good job of credentialing and making sure people actually have degrees in the classes they teach. Although, when your English professor is speaking in matters of political science, for example, are they a political scientist, or are they an English professor with pet political views that they're, trying to spread to their students through, ostensibly freewheeling discussion? Another thing to keep in mind is that people change over time. And so you look at the arc of people's views, people tend to get more conservative as they get older. Winston Churchill had this funny quote. He said, if you're not a liberal when you're 20, you got no heart. If you're not a conservative by the time you're 40, you got no head. So I hope that's not apocryphal and misattributed to Mr. Churchill. I'll have to look it up. But at least that's the sort of idea that people do change over time. So think about the student body too. So you have like a freewheeling discussion like this one, and the people who participate are like to have liberal views, because that's typically, you know, what students have. And also you think about your interest as a student, right? You're dependent on the state. You're probably getting student loans, or you're getting a Pell Grant. Might be living at home with your parents. Less so, I think, again, at Lane than other places. But you know, you're in a position where you're benefiting from lots of government services, and you're not seeing like the tax bill coming out of your paycheck, right? So that's, you know, you have all sorts of interests that might be affecting you on a conscious or unconscious level. Final thoughts on academia, or anything on like any of the readings. I might mention those a little bit the beginning of the next class too. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, like as you were just saying, about students being affected by receiving federal aid and things like that. Do you think on any level that's kind of like a form of coercion? You know what I mean? Because it seems like that's very true, and then if that is true, that people tend to switch when they're older. I know it's just a saying, but
Yeah.
you kind of lose that like handout from the government, suddenly you're anti that. I don't know, that just seems kind of manipulative.
I mean, it does when you think about the debt people go into, even with all the aid. And the dirty secret of academia is, because there's so much money flowing in, there's a tendency to overspend and then have students pick up the difference. And so you get like cost inflation. So basically, the more aid that's available, the more the more aid that's available, the more the college overspends. They don't say, oh, well, let's just keep the same programs and the same level of service, and it'll be cheaper for students. That's the way you think it would work, right? But actually, when more money flows in, the college says, oh, look, we have all this money to spend, and instead of like putting it directly towards like free tuition or something, right? They always add more programs and more services and things other than classroom instruction. And then you end up with you know, owing thousands of dollars when you graduate, and wondering how you're going to all pay it all off. Not so much with, you know, here, but you know, it can even be a problem with just a regular 4-year degree in Oregon. I'm paying 6 bills this year to University of Oregon for 10 credits. So you know, that can add up after a while. All right, we'll talk a little bit more about that, and then what are we doing next week? The